In the early years of the air war, the German Luftwaffe fought with a distinct geographical advantage. They knew exactly how much fuel an Allied fighter plane carried. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously boasted to the German people, "If an enemy aircraft flies over the Reich territory, my name is Meyer." Meyer being a common Jewish surname, intended as an insult. But beyond the bluster, there was a tactical reality. German intelligence knew the specs of the Spitfire and the early P-47 Thunderbolt. They knew these planes were thirsty. A P-47 consumed 100 gallons of high-octane fuel every hour at cruising speed. At combat power, it drank even more. Based on the internal fuel capacity of the early Thunderbolts, the Germans calculated a line of safety. Roughly speaking, this line was the German border. Allied bombers, the B-17s and B-24s, could fly past this line, but their fighter escorts had to turn back. This created a kill zone over central Germany. As soon as the American fighters turned for home, low on gas, the German fighters would pounce on the defenseless bombers. The German aces, men like Adolf Galland, built their entire defensive strategy around this range limit. They didn't engage the fighters near the coast. They waited. They waited until the little friends went home. Then they slaughtered the big friends. They believed this was a permanent state of affairs. They believed that the laws of physics prevented a single-engine fighter from carrying enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin and back, and still have enough gas to fight. They viewed the P-47 as a massive, inefficient gas guzzler. They mocked its size. They mocked its consumption. They didn't realize that American engineers were looking at the same math problem. But unlike the Germans, who accepted the limits of their machines, the Americans decided to change the machine. The Germans were betting their survival on the gas gauge of a P-47. It was a bet they were about to lose. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt arrived in England in 1942, it was already a beast. It was the biggest, heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. But despite its size, it had short legs. The early models, the P-47C and early D series, carried only 305 gallons of fuel in their main fuselage tanks. This gave them a combat radius of only about 200 miles. They could escort bombers across the English Channel, maybe as far as Antwerp or Paris, but then the red light would flicker on the dashboard. The pilots hated it. There is nothing more frustrating for a fighter pilot than seeing the enemy, but having to turn away because you don't have the gas to chase him. The P-47 pilots felt like tethered dogs. They could bark, but they couldn't bite anything outside their yard. The bomber command generals were desperate. The losses among the unescorted B-17s were reaching catastrophic levels. In 1943, raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg resulted in loss rates of 20%. You cannot sustain an air force with 20% losses. The cry went out to the engineers at Republic Aviation and the Army Air Forces, "We need range. We need it now." The Germans watched the American formations closely. They saw the P-47s turn back at the exact same spot, mission after mission. They grew complacent. They would form up their squadrons just east of the turn-back point, circling like sharks waiting for the lifeguard to leave the beach. They would taunt the Americans over the radio. "Goodbye, Yankee. Have a nice swim." They believed the P-47 was structurally incapable of long-range flight. They thought the engine was too big, the drag was too high. They dismissed the Thunderbolt as a tactical interceptor, miscast in a strategic role. But they underestimated the sheer modularity of the American design. The P-47 wasn't a delicate thoroughbred like the Spitfire. It was a truck. And like a truck, if you needed it to go further, you just bolted on more tanks. The era of the short-legged giant was ending. The era of the flying gas station was about to begin. The solution to the range problem wasn't aerodynamic, it was plumbing. American mechanics and engineers began a frantic modification program. They drilled holes in the wings of the P-47s. They ran fuel lines along the belly. They installed shackles under the wings and the fuselage. These shackles were designed to hold external fuel tanks, drop tanks. The concept was simple: take off with external tanks. Burn that fuel first to climb and cruise. When the enemy attacks, or when the tank is empty, pull a lever and drop it. Then, fight on your internal fuel. It sounds easy, but it was an engineering nightmare. The fuel had to be pumped from the external tanks into the engine, often at high altitudes where liquids freeze and pumps fail. They needed pressurized systems using exhaust gas from the vacuum pumps. The first attempts were clumsy. Tanks leaked. They wouldn't feed. They wouldn't drop. But the Americans threw resources at the problem. They developed 75-gallon steel tanks. Then 108-gallon tanks. Then massive 150-gallon flat tanks. This was the plumbing revolution. In the span of a few months, the fuel capacity of the P-47 effectively doubled. The German intelligence officers missed this shift. They saw photos of P-47s with bulges under their wings, but they assumed they were bombs. They didn't realize they were looking at liquid range. They were still calculating the P-47's endurance based on the 305-gallon internal tank. They didn't know that the P-47 was now carrying 500, 600, or eventually over 1,000 gallons of fuel in later long-range models. The American mechanics worked around the clock retrofitting the fleet in England. They were changing the strategic map of Europe with wrenches and rubber hoses. The P-47, the Jug, was becoming a camel. It could drink heavily and walk through the desert for days. And the Germans, sitting comfortably in their airfields deep in Germany, had no idea the camels were coming. One of the most ingenious inventions of the range war was made of paper. Specifically, compressed paper and glue. Metal was scarce. Steel was needed for ships and tanks. Aluminum was needed for airframes. So, the British and Americans developed the 108-gallon paper drop tank. It looked like a grey, cigar-shaped balloon. It was cheap. It was disposable. You used it once and threw it away. The Germans were baffled when they first found the wreckage of these tanks in fields in France. They looked like papier-mâché toys. The Americans are so desperate they are making fuel tanks out of cardboard, the German propaganda laughed. But the paper tank was the key to Berlin. It was light. It was aerodynamic. And it held just enough gas to get the P-47s across the Channel and halfway across Germany. In late 1943 and early 1944, the P-47s began to push the line. First to the Rhine, then to the Weser, then to the Elbe. With each mission, they held on to their drop tanks a little longer. The German fighter pilots began to notice something disturbing. They would wait at their usual safe gathering point, expecting the Americans to turn back. But the Americans didn't turn back. Instead, the P-47s would wobble slightly as the pilots pulled the release levers. Hundreds of silver and gray objects would tumble from the sky, the empty drop tanks falling like rain. Then, the P-47s, suddenly light and clean, would surge forward. The furniture vans would accelerate, their massive engines roaring, hunting for the German fighters. The sanctuary was shrinking. Every week, the line moved 50 miles east. The German aces found themselves being engaged over cities they thought were safe. They were being shot down over Bremen, over Hanover, over Brunswick. The surprise was total. That short-legged fighter had grown legs, and it was marching toward the capital. March 6, 1944. This was the date the German air defense strategy collapsed. The US 8th Air Force launched a massive raid on Berlin. The Big B. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s streamed across the North Sea. The German radar operators watched them coming. They alerted the fighter wings. The German pilots climbed into their Bf-109s and Fw-190s. They were confident. They knew the drill. They would wait until the American fighters reached their limit and turned back. Then, they would slaughter the bombers over the capital. They gathered their formations over Berlin, circling like wolves. But then, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Above the bombers, high in the contrails, were silver specks. They looked like P-47s. Impossible, the German controllers said. They don't have the range. They must be P-38s or P-51s. The P-51 Mustang was just entering service, but the P-47 arrived in force first. But as the specks grew larger, the distinct, barrel-chested silhouette of the Thunderbolt became unmistakable. They were over Berlin. And they weren't turning back. The P-47 pilots, dropping their paper tanks, checked their internal fuel gauges. They still had plenty. They dove on the German formations. The shock was absolute. It was as if the enemy had suddenly appeared in your living room. For the German pilots, the psychological sanctuary of the Reich defense vanished in an instant. They realized there was no safe space in the sky. The P-47s rampaged over the capital. They chased German fighters down to the rooftops of Berlin. They strafed airfields that had never seen an enemy fighter before. The German populace, looking up, saw the distinctive elliptical wings of the Thunderbolt and realized the promises of Hermann Göring were lies. The short-legged giant had just kicked down the front door of the Third Reich. The arrival of the long-range escorts broke the morale of the Luftwaffe. Until that moment, they had fought a war of attrition on their own terms. They chose when and where to fight. Now, they were forced to fight on the Americans' terms. General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, famously said, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The presence of the P-47s meant the German fighters couldn't form up. Usually, the Germans needed time to assemble their heavy Sturmbok, battering ram, Fw-190s, heavily armored fighters designed to kill bombers. These planes were heavy and slow. They needed agile Bf-109s to protect them. But the P-47s hit them while they were still climbing. They caught them at their most vulnerable moment, heavy with fuel and ammo, struggling for altitude. The Thunderbolt wall pushed the German interceptors further and further east. German pilots found themselves taking off and being engaged immediately by roaming packs of P-47s. They were being killed over their own runways. The radio chatter from this period captures the confusion. Indians at 12 o'clock. Indians meant enemy fighters. Where? We are over Magdeburg. They are everywhere. The P-47 pilots, emboldened by their extra fuel, became aggressive. They started fighter sweeps. They didn't just stick to the bombers. They went hunting. They roamed deep into Germany, looking for trouble. They attacked training schools. They attacked transport aircraft. They destroyed the Luftwaffe not just in the air, but on the ground. The German aces, who had built their scores on the Eastern Front or against unescorted bombers, suddenly found themselves fighting for survival against a plane that outdove them, outgunned them, and refused to go home. The shock wasn't just tactical, it was existential. If the Americans could fly fighters to Berlin, they could fly them anywhere. The war had no boundaries anymore. While the P-47D was terrorizing Germany, the war in the Pacific posed an even greater challenge. The distances in the Pacific were vast. Thousands of miles of open ocean. To escort the new B-29 Superfortresses from Saipan to Tokyo, the Army Air Forces needed a fighter with even more range. Republic Aviation responded with the ultimate evolution of the Thunderbolt, the P-47N. The engineers looked at the P-47 and realized they had run out of room in the fuselage. They couldn't put any more tanks inside. So, they looked at the wings. The standard P-47 wing was efficient, but it was dry, it contained guns and ammo, but no fuel. For the end model, they designed a completely new wing. It was longer. It had squared-off tips, clipped wings, to improve the roll rate. But crucially, it was a wet wing. They installed fuel tanks inside the wing structure itself. This added 200 gallons of internal fuel. Combined with the fuselage tanks and external drop tanks, the P-47N could carry over 1,200 gallons of fuel. To put that in perspective, the standard P-47C carried 305 gallons. A Bf-109 carried about 100 gallons. The P-47N carried more fuel than some early war bombers. It was a flying tanker. To handle the massive weight, now approaching 20,000 pounds fully loaded, they strengthened the landing gear and added a new, more powerful version of the AS 2800 engine, the -57 series. The result was a monster. It looked like a P-47, but it had the legs of a marathon runner. The wet wing concept was a triumph of American engineering audacity. The Germans were struggling to build basic airframes. The Americans were redesigning entire wing structures just to add a few hundred miles of range. It showed a nation that refused to accept limits. If the ocean was wide, they would build a wider wing. The P-47N was the technological answer to the tyranny of distance. The capabilities of the P-47N were mind-boggling. It had a combat radius of over 1,000 miles. That meant it could fly 1,000 miles out, fight, and fly 1,000 miles back. A 2,000-mile round trip in a single-engine fighter. Pilots called these bunion runs or butt-busters. They would sit in the cockpit for 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours. It required a new kind of physical endurance. But strategically, it changed everything. When the P-47 arrived in the Pacific in 1945, stationed on Iwo Jima and Saipan, the Japanese homelands were suddenly naked. The Japanese air defense, like the Germans, relied on the idea that fighters couldn't reach them. They thought the B-29s would come alone. Instead, the B-29s arrived with a swarm of Thunderbolts. The P-47 would loiter over Japan, picking fights. They would strafe airfields in Kyushu and Honshu. They hunted the last surviving Japanese aces. The Japanese pilots, flying lightweight Frank or George fighters, were shocked to see single-engine American planes so far from any base. They tried to engage, thinking the Americans must be low on fuel. But the P-47 had fuel to burn. They would fight for 20 minutes, full throttle, and still have enough gas to fly the 3 hours back to Iwo Jima. The 2,000-mile escort meant that the U.S. could project air superiority across an entire ocean. It was the final nail in the coffin for the Axis air forces. They couldn't hide in the rear. They couldn't hide in the heartland. The long arm of the Thunderbolt could reach out and touch them anywhere on the map. The German aces who had dismissed the short-legged giant in 1943 would have wept if they saw what it had become in 1945. It had grown legs that could stride across continents. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had deployed a weapon that should have changed the war, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. It was 100 miles per hour faster than the P-47. In a fair fight, the P-47 couldn't touch it. But the P-47 pilots didn't fight fair. They used their secret weapon, loiter time. The Me-262 had a fatal flaw. Its early Jumo jet engines consumed fuel at a voracious rate. It had a flight time of only about 60 to 90 minutes. The P-47 pilots knew this. They developed a tactic known as rat catching. Instead of trying to chase the jets at high altitude, the P-47s would fly deep into Germany, circling high above the known jet airfields like Rhein and Alkmaar. Because of their external drop tanks and massive internal fuel capacity, the Thunderbolts could stay there for hours. They just orbited, watching and waiting. When the German jets returned from a mission, they were low on fuel. They had to slow down to land. They were vulnerable. This was the moment that Jug pilots struck. They would dive from the clouds, screaming down at 500 miles per hour. The German jet pilots, usually gliding in on fumes, would look up in horror to see a 7-ton radial engine monster filling their rearview mirror. The P-47s would tear the jets apart on their final approach, or strafe them as they taxied on the ground. It was a brutal tactic. It exploited the enemy's logistical weakness. The German pilots called it unsporting. They felt that shooting a plane while it was landing was murder. But the American pilots called it air superiority. They realized that speed means nothing if you can't stay in the fight. The P-47 neutralized the technological advantage of the jet simply by being able to outweight it. German aces like Walter Nautny, the first jet ace, were killed this way, caught low and slow by conventional fighters that had the gas to camp on their doorstep. The P-47 proved that endurance was a weapon just as lethal as speed. The furniture van had become the jet killer simply by refusing to go home. The engineering marvel of the long-range P-47 came with a hidden human cost. The engineers had figured out how to make the machine fly for 8 or 10 hours. But they hadn't figured out how to make the human body endure it. A very long-range, VLR, escort mission was a physical torture test. The cockpit of the P-47 was comfortable compared to a Bf-109, but sitting in one position for 8 hours strapped into a parachute and harness is grueling. The vibration of the massive R2800 engine was constant. It numbed the hands and feet. It rattled the bones. The noise, even through headphones, was a dull roar that induced fatigue. But the biggest problem was biology. Pilots had to drink water to stay alert. But at 30,000 feet, physiology changes. The relief tube, a rubber hose connected to a venturi tube on the outside of the plane, was the most hated piece of equipment on the aircraft. It often froze. It was difficult to use while wearing layers of flight gear and strapped into a seat. Piddle packs, sponges in bags, were issued, but they were messy and undignified. Pilots often dehydrated themselves deliberately before a mission to avoid the problem, leading to headaches and reduced reaction times in combat. Then there was the cold. At 30,000 feet, it was -40 degrees. The cockpit heater worked, but it struggled to keep up on such long flights. Sweat would freeze inside the oxygen mask. By the time a P-47 pilot returned to base in England or Saipan after an 8-hour mission, he was a wreck. Ground crews would often have to lift the pilots out of the cockpits. Their legs were cramped, their ears ringing, their faces marked by the oxygen mask. They would stagger to the debriefing hut, fueled only by adrenaline and cigarettes. The German pilots flew 45-minute sorties. They returned to a warm mess hall. The American pilots were flying endurance marathons every few days. It required a mental toughness that went beyond courage. It required the ability to endure boredom, discomfort, and pain for hours, only to be sharp enough to fight for 5 minutes of terror over the target. The P-47N didn't just test the limits of range, it tested the limits of the human bladder and the human will. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively vanished from the skies. But the P-47 still had plenty of targets. With their superiority secured, the long-range Thunderbolts were unleashed on the ground. They roamed the deepest recesses of the Third Reich, areas that the Germans had considered safe rear areas for the entire war. Southern Bavaria, Austria, Czechoslovakia. German units retreating into these areas thought they were out of reach of the tactical air force. They were wrong. P-47 pilots, with gas to spare, would drop down to the deck and go armed recce, armed reconnaissance. They hunted trains. They hunted trucks. They hunted barges on the Danube. They found German aircraft hiding in the forests. The Germans had built autobahn strips, using the highways as runways, and hid their Me-262s and Ju-88s in the trees nearby. The P-47s found them. They would come in at treetop height, 8 machine guns blazing. They destroyed thousands of German aircraft on the ground. the German soldiers on the ground felt a profound sense of helplessness. There was no front line anymore. The sky was the front line, and the sky was everywhere. A German column moving through a remote mountain pass in Austria would suddenly be shredded by a flight of P-47s that had taken off from France or Italy hours ago. The psychological impact was total. The Jabos are everywhere, the German letters home read. We cannot move. We cannot sleep. The P-47 had turned the entirety of Germany into a free-fire zone. It erased the concept of strategic depth. The German aces, hiding in their forest camouflages, waiting for fuel that would never come, watched the silver giants roar overhead and realized that their tactics, their skills, and their bravery were meaningless against an enemy who could fly forever. When the war ended, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as the ultimate symbol of American air power doctrine. It wasn't the prettiest plane. It wasn't the most agile. But it was the toughest, and it had the longest reach. The P-47N, the final evolution, was a technological marvel of range. It proved that in a global war, the most important metric isn't how tight you can turn, but how far you can go. The German Luftwaffe was built for a sprint. A short, violent dash across the border. The U.S. Army Air Forces were built for a marathon. A relentless, grinding flight across continents and oceans. The German aces had dismissed the P-47 as a furniture van. But that van had delivered the bomb load to Berlin. It had delivered the escort to the B-17s. It had delivered the final blow to the Luftwaffe. As the sun set on the airfields of Europe and the Pacific in 1945, the P-47 pilots climbed out of their cockpits, stiff, exhausted, and deafened. They patted the massive, oil-stained cowlings of their machines. They knew they had flown the heavyweights of the war. They had proven that you don't need to be a dancer to win a fight. You just need to be able to take a punch, and have enough gas to stay in the ring until the other guy collapses. The P-47 was the sledgehammer that broke the Third Reich's roof. And its legacy is the simple, brutal truth of air warfare: range is the ultimate air superiority weapon.